California is running out of water, and this time just when we started showering again. 19,000 acres of forest have already burned this year, and 72% of the entire West is in severe drought. Median time to get approval to build a house there is 627 days. That's 217 days longer than it took to build the Empire State Building. You need 87 permits, 15 from the Planning Commission, 26 from the Public Utilities Commission. California have doubled in that time, despite the fact that almond production alone uses more water than all the humans and businesses in San Francisco and Los Angeles combined, even on days when your teenage son spends 2 hours showering. Look at this chart of how much water it takes to grow different crops. Oranges, tomatoes, strawberries, all take... I don't fear AI anymore because it couldn't possibly be any more robotic than the humans who run things now.
Bill Maher didn't raise his voice, and that's what made it worse. Because when he started breaking down California's system on live TV, it didn't sound like opinion anymore. It sounded like exposure. Step by step, he started pointing at something most leaders avoid saying out loud: that the system is so layered, so slowed down, and so buried in rules, it barely moves anymore. And right at the center of that conversation, Gavin Newsom, not because he interrupted anything, but because everything Bill described leads straight back to leadership. And once you hear it, it becomes hard to ignore. Because this isn't just criticism of one state. It's a look at what happens when a system keeps expanding rules but stops delivering results. And the breakdown starts now.
Can't call it a drought if it happens all the time. In a story I'm getting tired of reporting, California is running out of water, and this time just when we started showering again. 19,000 acres of forest have already burned this year, and 72% of the entire West is in severe drought. Turns out hot girl summer is for reals.
California looks powerful from the outside. Huge economy, global influence, massive tax revenue. But underneath that image, a very different reality is building. Delays, bureaucracy, slow recovery after disasters, and growing frustration from people who feel like nothing actually moves when it should. That's the tension Bill Maher steps into. He's not defending a party. He's not attacking for entertainment. He's looking at a system that claims to be efficient and asking why real life doesn't match that promise. And that's where Gavin Newsom gets pulled into the center of it. Because when things feel broken at scale, leadership becomes the focus, whether it wants to be or not. And what Bill is about to highlight isn't a single failure. It's a pattern that repeats across the entire system.
Median time to get approval to build a house there is 627 days. That's 217 days longer than it took to build the Empire State Building. You need 87 permits, 15 from the Planning Commission, 26 from the Public Utilities Commission and the Fire Department, 19 from building inspectors, 17 from the Public Works, 10 related to public spaces, and 1 from a guy in a t-shirt that says Federal Inspector. It's no wonder that in 2021, San Francisco issued only 2,000 permits for new homes. Sure, there are people living in the streets, but that's because we want to make sure the apartments they don't live in are...
This is where the conversation really sharpens. Because Bill Maher starts with something simple: building. Not politics, not ideology. Just the basic ability to construct, rebuild, and move forward. And what he points out is uncomfortable. Because in California, even that process has turned into a maze. Permits, approvals, regulations, layers upon layers of checks that stretch timelines far beyond what most people would expect in a modern system. And the result isn't just inconvenience. It's delay that turns into damage. People displaced by disasters aren't just rebuilding homes. They're waiting inside a system that moves so slowly, time itself becomes part of the problem. And that's where the contradiction hits hard. Because this is one of the richest states in the country. Massive tax revenue, massive infrastructure, massive resources. But somehow, basic rebuilding still feels stuck. And Bill's argument isn't subtle here. When it takes longer to build essential housing today than it did to construct landmark projects decades ago, the system isn't just slow anymore. It's broken in how it operates. And once that idea lands, everything else starts to look connected.
It's the place that spends money and gets nothing, which is why you may have noticed when the fires broke out, no one escaped by high-speed rail. We have the highest marginal tax rate in America, higher than almost all other states, and soon Greenland. Now, is wokeness the main reason for the fires? Of course not. But it's also not wrong to associate some of the unforced errors our government made with the things normies see as hallmarks of uber-progressive politics: questionable budget priorities, high taxes that get you nothing, making everything about identity politics, virtue signaling overseas instead of tending to the nuts and bolts.
It's not just about disaster response anymore. It's about what happens after the cameras leave, when the promises are already made, but the reality still hasn't moved. And the uncomfortable question becomes unavoidable. How does recovery stay this slow in a place that claims to lead on everything? Because for the people living it, this isn't politics. It's delay becoming their daily life. And that tension keeps building.
Perpetual drought here, yet almond farmers in California have doubled in that time, despite the fact that almond production alone uses more water than all the humans and businesses in San Francisco and Los Angeles combined, even on days when your teenage son spends 2 hours showering. Look at this chart of how much water it takes to grow different crops. Oranges, tomatoes, strawberries all take about 11 gallons to make 1 pound. Almonds, 1,900 gallons. That wasn't a problem back when it rained, but now there simply isn't enough water to go around, and we have to make a painful choice, getting it to the people or getting it in the nuts.
Now, here's where the frustration turns into something sharper. Because California isn't just any state when it comes to money. It's one of the highest tax environments in the country. So naturally, the expectation is simple. If you're paying more, you should be getting more. Better infrastructure, faster recovery, smoother systems, stronger results. But that's where the contradiction hits hard. Because what people feel instead is the opposite. High cost, but slow execution. Heavy taxation, but long delays. Massive revenue, but systems that still feel clogged. And Bill Maher's point lands right in that tension. He's basically pointing at a disconnect that's hard to explain away. Where is all the efficiency supposed to come from? Because when a system collects at the top level, but struggles at the ground level, people stop looking at individual issues. They start questioning the structure itself. And that's where trust begins to erode. Not in one moment, but slowly, through repeated frustration. And once that starts, it's hard to reverse.
You know, it's not like California doesn't know how to regulate. They know. We are the most regulated state in the nation with more than 395,000 regulatory restrictions. It is a constant nightmare of inspectors and permits and fees. In this state, if you get to your car 10 seconds after the parking meter expires, it's already gone and you'll never see it again. California has rules about every nitpicky thing you can imagine. If you don't believe me, try parking in Santa Monica, or starting a business, or getting your solar power.
And then comes one of the most long-running issues in the background water. Not new, not sudden, not surprising. This is something Californians have been warning about for years. Drought cycles, supply pressure, long-term sustainability concerns. And yet, from the outside looking in, it feels like the response has never matched the urgency of the problem. Instead of bold structural fixes, what people often hear are conservation messages directed at everyday residents. Cut back, use less, adjust behavior. But here's where the tension sharpens again. Because while households are told to conserve, large-scale water usage in agriculture and industry continues operating on a completely different level. And that contrast creates friction, not just politically, but logically, because people start asking a simple question. If this is a crisis, why does responsibility feel so uneven? And Bill Maher's angle here is less about blame and more about imbalance. Warnings have been there for years. The signals have been visible, but the system keeps moving in a way that feels reactive instead of decisive. And when that pattern repeats across multiple issues, water stops being just a resource problem. It becomes another example of delayed response inside a much larger system that struggles to move fast when it matters most. This is where the conversation stops feeling abstract and starts getting uncomfortable. Because while everyday Californians are being told to cut back, conserve, and adjust their habits, there's a much bigger layer most people don't talk about as loudly: agriculture. And specifically, massive water-intensive crops like almonds. Bill Maher's point here isn't complicated. You can't keep asking individuals to carry the burden of conservation while the biggest consumers operate on a completely different scale. And that's where the frustration builds, because it creates a visible imbalance. On one side, regular households are told to limit showers, reduce usage, and change daily behavior. On the other side, large-scale agricultural systems continue operating with enormous demand. And people notice that gap, even if no one says it directly at first. Because eventually the question becomes unavoidable. Is conservation actually being distributed fairly, or just selectively enforced? And once that idea enters the conversation, it changes how the entire issue is viewed. Not as a personal responsibility problem, but as a structural one. And that's where tension starts to rise again. From here, the focus shifts even further up the chain. Because it's not just agriculture that comes into question. It's the broader idea of who actually faces pressure in the system, and who doesn't. Bill Maher's underlying argument is simple. If rules exist, they should apply evenly. But what people often perceive instead is a system where enforcement feels uneven depending on size, influence, and leverage. Large corporations operate at a scale where scrutiny often looks very different from what everyday individuals experience. And that contrast creates friction. Because while regular people deal with permits, restrictions, and constant regulation in their daily lives, major institutions are often viewed as moving through a much smoother version of the same system. And that's where public frustration starts to grow. Not necessarily because of one specific policy, but because of perception. Who carries the weight of the rules? And who seems to move past them with less resistance? Bill Maher doesn't frame it as conspiracy. He frames it as imbalance. And once that imbalance becomes visible, it becomes difficult to unsee. Now the conversation hits one of the most symbolic examples of all: the high-speed rail project. On paper, it was supposed to be transformative. A major infrastructure leap, connecting key parts of the state. A modern solution for transportation efficiency. But the reality tells a very different story. Years of delays, rising costs, constant revisions, and a timeline that keeps stretching further away from completion. Bill Maher's criticism here isn't subtle, because when a project reaches this scale, the expectation isn't perfection. It's progress. But what people see instead is momentum that never quite arrives. And that creates a deeper question. When billions are invested, but results stay uncertain for years, what exactly is going wrong in the process? Because at that point, it stops being just a construction issue. It becomes a system issue, a question of how decisions are made, approved, and carried forward over time. And the longer it drags on, the more it becomes a reference point for inefficiency itself. A project that was meant to represent progress, slowly turning into a symbol of delay. This is where Bill Maher's broader argument starts to come into focus. Because by this point, it's no longer about individual problems. It's about a pattern, a system that appears to prioritize structure, process, and ideological direction, sometimes over measurable outcomes. And that's the core tension he's pointing at. Because when outcomes consistently lag behind expectations, people stop looking at isolated issues. They start questioning the underlying approach. Why do so many processes take so long? Why do so many solutions feel incomplete? Why does progress feel uneven across different areas? And the answer, depending on perspective, becomes either complicated or uncomfortable. Because systems built around layers of rules, approvals, and competing priorities often struggle with speed and adaptability. And when that happens repeatedly across housing, water, infrastructure, and recovery, it starts to form a bigger narrative, not of one failure, but of a structure that may be optimized for process more than results. And that's the tension Bill Maher is really highlighting. Not just what is happening, but why it keeps happening in different forms across the board. At this point, everything Bill Maher has pointed to starts collapsing into one central idea. He's not arguing small policy disagreements anymore. He's not talking about isolated mistakes. He's pointing at something bigger. A system that, in his view, is no longer producing the outcomes it promises. And that's the line that hits hardest. Because once you strip away the political language, the messaging, the branding, you're left with a very basic question. If a system requires this much explanation, why does it still feel this inefficient in real life? Bill's core message is blunt. Too many layers, too many delays, too many processes that seem disconnected from results. And instead of speed, people get waiting. Instead of clarity, they get complexity. Instead of solutions, they get more steps. And that's where the frustration builds into something sharper. Because it's not just that things are imperfect, it's that the imperfections keep repeating across different areas of life. Housing, infrastructure, disaster recovery, resources. And when that pattern becomes visible, the argument stops being about leadership style. It becomes about system design. And Bill Maher's conclusion is simple, but heavy. If the system is constantly slowing outcomes instead of delivering them, then something inside it is fundamentally not working the way it's supposed to. And now, the conversation takes its most uncomfortable turn. Because if these issues were random, they would feel easier to dismiss. A delay here, a mistake there, a project gone wrong. But that's not how it appears when you zoom out. Instead, it starts to look repetitive. The same patterns showing up again and again. Slow recovery after disasters. Infrastructure projects dragging for years. Resource debates that never fully resolve. Systems that feel increasingly complex, but not necessarily more effective. And that's where the escalation happens. Because once people recognize repetition, they stop seeing isolated failures. They start seeing momentum in the wrong direction. And the question shifts from what went wrong to something more uncomfortable. Why does this keep happening? Is it bad execution? Is it structural design? Or is it a system that has become too layered to adjust quickly when problems appear? Bill Maher doesn't try to soften that tension. He leans into it, because in his framing, the longer these patterns continue, the harder they are to ignore. And that creates a cycle. Problems lead to more rules. More rules lead to slower action. Slower action leads to bigger frustration. And bigger frustration leads back into the same loop. And that's the escalation he's pointing to. Not a single failure point, but a repeating system pattern that keeps feeding itself. By this point, the argument stops being just about California. It stops being just about Gavin Newsom. And it even stops being about Bill Maher's criticism. Because what's actually being exposed here is something deeper in how modern governance is perceived when results don't match expectations. Bill's entire breakdown keeps circling back to one uncomfortable idea. When systems become too layered, too slow, and too complicated to navigate, people stop trusting them to deliver. And once that trust starts slipping, every new failure doesn't feel isolated anymore. It feels connected. Housing delays don't feel like accidents. Infrastructure overruns don't feel like one-off mistakes. Disaster recovery doesn't feel like a rare issue. It all starts to blend into one larger narrative of inefficiency. And that's the real turning point. Because at that stage, people aren't just reacting to policies. They're reacting to a pattern. A pattern where promises sound strong, but results take too long to arrive. And Bill Maher's framing forces that tension into the open. Not by offering a perfect solution, but by highlighting what happens when outcomes consistently lag behind expectations. And whether you agree with him or not, that's the part that sticks. Because once a system is seen through that lens, it becomes very hard to unsee it. What looked like a political discussion at the surface slowly turned into something more layered. This wasn't just Bill Maher criticizing Gavin Newsom. And it wasn't just about California's policies either. It became a broader breakdown of how systems function when complexity starts outweighing speed and results. And that's why this moment stood out. Because it wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It was structured, deliberate, and pointed. And that's often what makes it more impactful. Not the volume, but the clarity of what's being highlighted. At the end of the day, the question this raises isn't small. When a system consistently struggles to turn resources into results, what exactly needs to change? That's the real takeaway here. And it's something worth thinking about beyond just one state or one debate. Because if this pattern repeats anywhere, the outcome tends to feel familiar. And that's where the real concern sits.